thought, okay, we're still in July, aren't we? Thank you. We're excited to have Jack and Anna with us tonight. A lot of you will know this through other Contact Association, but they've recently been asked to come work with the Eastside Church in Midwest City, and we're personally excited about that. It's such a wonderful congregation, and we're excited for them and pray they'll have a long and a productive ministry there. And it's been very interesting to just listen to different presentations from the book of Psalms, and we're looking forward to his presentation tonight. And it's kind of odd for me as the outsider to tell him, welcome home.
When I saw the summer series list that had 4 Dodgen family members on it, I had 2 thoughts. One of those was, isn't that cool to be a part of? You know, my dad spoke last week, and I've had 2 uncles speak, and that's a cool thing to be a part of. My second thought was, who puts that together? Because that was not I don't know if that was the best idea. Dodgens are not meant to be taken in large doses like that. You really want small doses over a long period of time, but it's too late for that now. That's just something moving forward. I want to ask you a question as we get started tonight. What do you do when everything around you is falling apart? When you don't know what comes next? When the things that you're dealing with at the current moment are terrible, seem hopeless? What do you do? What do you do when everything is falling apart? While you're thinking about that, I want to tell you about a man named David Goggins. This is him right there. Here's what this article written about him says. David Goggins was just another poor African-American boy. You may say he was underprivileged given his upbringing. In his own words, his life should have been a statistic. He was born in 1975 in upstate New York. His father was a violent pimp who beat him and his mother regularly until they left him. He grew up being verbally abused every day of his life. He was labeled with a learning disability because he could not read, a fact made even more pronounced by his stutter. And on top of that, he would go on to develop asthma. But that doesn't stop there for him. After dropping out of school, he did not obtain a higher education or job qualification. He didn't have a plan, and therefore he had no future. He would have, by polite nomenclature, been defined as socioeconomically disadvantaged. Later, he joined the army, but he flunked out due to having sickle cell trait. But as he would later admit, he actually flunked out due to cowardice. After his discharge, he became obese. He spent his days working menial labor jobs requiring little social interaction or skill. One of his more notable jobs involved spraying for cockroaches in dirty restaurants after closing time. That is David Goggins' life, at least up to a point. There's more to the story, and we'll talk about what comes next for him. But I want to stop there, because in answering this question, what do you do when everything around you is falling apart? Maybe it's a long period of time, maybe it's only a short period of time. That sounds like some of the things we might do. He drops out of something that is difficult because of what's going on in his life. When everything was falling apart, he said, I'm out of here. When everything was falling apart, he said, you know what, I'm just going to do whatever I can find that requires the least amount of interaction with people. You know, right now, you might be in one of those situations where everything around you seems to be falling apart. First of all, we spent some amount of time in quarantine, being at home. The statistics of suicides increasing during that time have shown us that that's become pretty difficult for a lot of people, and who knows, that may happen again. On top of that, there are people that have lost their jobs or are going to lose their jobs. There are businesses that have closed and that will be closing potentially, that are going to fight to try and survive. There are people concerned about their finances. There are people concerned about where they're going to live here in just a week. Maybe that's some of you. On top of that, there are protests going on in various parts of the nation. On top of that, there are riots in some of those places where protests are going on. Oh, and by the way, on top of that, this is a presidential election year. And it seems to be a small footnote compared to everything else. And then on top of all of that, there's all the personal stuff you may be dealing with your marriage, with your own home, with your own family, with some of your own friends. What do you do when everything seems to be falling apart? Tonight, I want to talk about Psalm 85, because it is a psalm by weary people for weary people. I think at this moment in time, this psalm has a lot to say to us as people who are dealing with quite a lot in the world. Here's the plan going forward tonight. Psalm 85 breaks down very easily for us in verses 1 through 13, past, present, future. That's how it's written, that's how it's laid out, that's how we're going to deal with it, past, present, future. The way we're going to look at it is when we are in present troubles or difficulties, how do we look at our past? How do we look at our present when we're going through those present difficulties? And how do we view our future when we're in those present difficulties? Alongside that, I want us to talk about, one, here is what Psalm 85 says we ought to do. And then I want to talk about what we tend to do more often than not, or what we see happen in the world more often than not. And then when we get to the end of all of this, we're going to talk about how we can do and live out what Psalm 85 talks about and why it's so important that we do that. But before any of that, let's talk about the background. I said that this psalm is by weary people, for weary people. Why are they so weary? What's going on with the people of Psalm 85? If we start there in verse 1, and that's as far as we need to go to understand this, Lord, you were favorable to your land. You restored the fortunes of Jacob. This word land is used 3 times throughout Psalm 85. It's there in verse 9 and there again in verse 12. There's this focus on the place where they live, because this psalm was probably written when they returned back to their land after captivity. Probably about the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, when they're all coming back out of this time of exile, coming back home to their land. And that second part there in verse 1, you restored the fortunes of Jacob. Israel has been given back what belonged to them, has that same kind of indication. That they were away, and now God has given it back to them, their fortunes, the promised land. It's theirs again. Here's why they're so weary. Just think about it. One, they've just spent 70 years as strangers in a place where they lost their culture to some degree. They lost their worship to some degree. They had synagogues, they had places where they could meet, but they didn't have the temple. And so they couldn't worship in the way that they wanted to. They couldn't worship in the way that they were used to. Does that sound maybe a little familiar to us right now? So they're weary because of that. But now they're back home after 70 years, and they come back to the promised land, except the promised land doesn't look as pretty as it did when they left in the first place. First of all, Jerusalem has no walls. And we might, okay, who cares about walls? Walls are very important for them because at any point, because they don't have walls, some enemy could just walk in, enemies that may have come and occupied the land in the 70 years that they've been gone. And so they're back home, but they have to live in fear that any moment they could just be taken out now and just picked off. They're no longer under the protection of the nation that they were exiled in. They're on their own now. That's going to cause them to be weary. But then on top of that, they've missed worship for so long, but there's no temple here. We got to build the temple back. And Ezra and Nehemiah document all of this stuff, but that's what they're dealing with. They've just come off of a very difficult time away, and now that they're back, the work has just begun. These are weary people writing Psalm 85. That's the background. That's where these people are coming from. Now I want to talk about what God's people do when we are weary, what we do when everything around us is falling apart. Number one, we're supposed to reflect on the past. Read verses 1 through 3 with me. Lord, you were favorable to your land. You restored the fortunes of Jacob. You forgave the iniquity of your people. You covered all of their sin. You withdrew all of your wrath. You turned from your hot anger. There are 6 past tense verbs that start off these first 3 verses that we lead into the psalm with. But before we have those listed out, first word, Lord. Here is what you did. They're coming back to this new land. This new land to them, because they haven't been here for so long, this old land. And they start off with, let's remember everything that God has done for us. And they lay it out. And they want this focus to be on what God has done in the past. And they list all these verbs here. You were favorable to your land. You restored the fortunes of Jacob. You brought us back. You forgave, verse 2, the iniquity of your people, and you covered all of their sin. Forgave, if you want to think of it in these terms, forgave is he took their sin and threw it away. It's gone. It was removed from them. But then the next word there, you covered all of their sin. That is, you sealed it up. So there's nowhere for it to be found. It's hidden. It's gone. It's all taken away. It's all out of here. And then they go there in verse 3, 2 more. You withdrew all your wrath. You turned from your hot anger. The sin's gone. No more anger. You're back home. They reflect on the past and what God has done. But there's one more important part I want us to get before we talk about the second part here. Right after verse 2, there's a 5-letter word that when we read through the Psalms, we tend to just ignore. We don't read it. I didn't read it when I read just a moment ago. Selah, S-E-L-A-H, right there, the right-hand side. That is, as best we can understand, a music term. The Psalms were not just poetry, they were music. You might have the superscript there at the beginning, to the choir master, a psalm of the sons of Korah. It's a song. And that phrase is akin to our rest in a song. Now, there is a little bit of a variation. When we have a rest in a song, when we're singing along and we see, okay, there's no notes here, what that means for us is take a breath, get ready for what comes next, make sure that you have the ability to project the words that are about to come next. Make sure that you have enough air to be able to hit these notes that are about to come up in the song, right? It's a break for what's about to happen. From what we understand about this word is that it's not a break for about what's to happen. It is a stop and think about what you just said. So with that in mind, verses 1 through 3 again. Lord, you were favorable to your land. You restored the fortunes of Jacob. You forgave the iniquity of your people. You covered all of their sin. You withdrew all your wrath. You turned from your hot anger. It's like you get through verses 1 and 2, and the psalmists say, listen, do you understand what you just said? You just spent 70 years away from home, and now you stop and reflect on what God has done. And when you get to the part that says he brought you back, he removed all of your sins from you, stop and think about that. Why were they gone in the first place? Their sin had taken them away. That's all gone. When God's people are experiencing something in their life that makes it seem like everything around them is falling apart, they should stop to reflect on the past. Here's what we often see. Now, I want to say this next part, and we'll do this for all three of these. We see this in people that do not have God much of the time, but it also exists among Christians. These are things that I have done, and they may be things that you have done as well. We should reflect on the past. We often rush over it. If I asked you, and I may just do that here at the end of the sermon, but if I asked you to make a list of times past where you thought everything was falling apart around you then, you could do it. No doubt. Some of your list would be longer than others, but everybody would have a list. Because we can look back and go, God has done this for... When I thought I wasn't going to be able to take care of this, God came through. When I was worried about my house or my finances or my job or my here's how God came through. We can all do that. And look back, look at the past and say, I know, I can see where God has done something. But sometimes, maybe often, we run to, I know what God has done, but this time it's different. And we've got a lot of reasons why it's always different this time. It's different this time because, well, last time that stuff wasn't as bad as what I'm dealing with right now. And so, yeah, he came through then, but this is a lot harder this time. And so it's different. It's different. It's not going to work out the same way. Or maybe we look at it and go, yeah, God has been involved that time when things were bad then, but I'm not deserving of that. And so this time, he's just going to let me deal with it by myself. Or maybe we say, last time, God pulled me out of all that stuff, but you know what? I do deserve the bad things that are happening to me here, and so he's just going to let them happen. We've got a lot of reasons why it's always different this time. And so even though we can make the list and say, well, last time God did this and this and this, we look at this time and say it's different this time. I'm just not convinced he's going to come through this time. We rush over it. And we treat the past list as if it didn't really amount to much anyway. That is not what the people of God are supposed to do. When things around us are falling apart, the people of God reflect on the past. Number 2, when the things around us are falling apart, the people of God request in the present. This is verses 4 through 7. Restore us again, O God of our salvation, and put away your indignation toward us. Will you be angry with us forever? Will you prolong your anger to all generations? Will you not revive us again, that your people may rejoice in you? Show us your steadfast love, O Lord. Grant us your salvation. There are 3 questions here, and we'll talk about the questions a little bit more in a moment. But I want you to notice what surrounds these questions, beginning and end. Verse 4, verse 7. 4 requests. Restore us again, O God of our salvation, and put away your indignation toward us. Verse 7 is very similar to that. Show us your steadfast love and grant us your salvation. Well, he already talked about the God of our salvation in verse 4. We might be able to say that this isn't really 4 separate requests, but one that's repeated in a couple places. Notice this, though, in verse 4. Restore us again, O God of our salvation. Look at verse 1 now. You were favorable to your land. You restored the fortunes of Jacob. Then he says, O God of our salvation, right, in verse 4. Look at verse 2. You forgave the iniquity of your people. You covered all of their sin. That's salvation. Then the last part of verse 4, put away your indignation towards us, verse 3. You withdrew all of your wrath. You turned from your hot anger. Verse 4 is just a restating of verses 1 through 3. God, you've done this in the past. We've reflected on it. We started there. We're asking you, we're requesting that you please do it again because we need it. Because here Israel sits in the promised land after being gone for so long. And they're saying to God, God, we know what you have done throughout the past history of Israel. We're requesting that you do it again. And as a result of those requests in verses 4 and verse 7, it seems to me that the questions here are a little more rhetorical in nature. That Israel is not concerned that God is just going to continue doing this forever, because he has already shown in verses 1 through 3 that that's not who he is. And we'll get more of an indication of that later on in the psalm. I do want to say this. It's okay to ask questions. God is fine with your questions, whatever those questions are. Ask those questions. But I do want us to understand here, these questions from the psalmist, they know the answer. God's not going to keep his anger going. God's not going to leave us in a position where we're not revived and he just leaves us weary. He leaves us feeling as if everything's falling apart because verses 1 through 3 and because of what we're going to see in verses 8 through 13 here in just a bit. They know the answers to these questions. God is going to take care of them because he always has. But they requested of it again. They don't just assume that he's going to do it again. God, we ask that you help us like you've helped us in the past. When the world is falling apart around us, the people of God request in the present. What we often do is question. Now again, questions are okay. But I want you to understand this. These questions here, will you be angry with us forever? They know he won't be. Will you prolong your anger to all generations? They know that he won't. They've already seen this in verses 1 through 3. Will you not revive us again that your people may rejoice in you? They know that he will revive them again. There's no indignation in these questions. They're not thinking the worst of God in these questions. But in my questions, I absolutely do sometimes. When the world around me is falling apart and I ask the question, God, why me? That is not saying to God, well, God, I know that you love me, that you care about me. That's me saying to God, God, I don't deserve this. What I do deserve is better than this. I shouldn't have to be dealing with this. My questions are a little more upset. My questions assume that things should be different for me. That's not the questions that these people are asking. Those are the questions I ask sometimes. I assume that these things shouldn't be happening, that God should know I'm already dealing with enough. I don't need more. Now, if anybody has some right to say that, I would think that these psalmists have more of a right than I do. Because what they're going through is way worse than anything I have gone through. Coming back home, seeing the promised land as the people of God in ruins. But they know that God's going to take care of it. It would be very tempting for them, too, to ask the questions, God, why would you bring us here just to be defeated by some group of enemies that have taken up residence here while we've been gone? And why would you bring us to a place that's defenseless? Why would you bring us back to the Holy Land that has no temple? We've been without a temple, and now we're defenseless without a temple. Before, at least, we had some kind of defense. They could ask those questions. Instead, they said, God, we're looking around, and this is tough. and so we humbly ask, you please deliver us, O God of our salvation. There's no pride in that whatsoever, but in our questions, often is. When the world around us is falling apart, Christians should request the power of God to help in that present danger. Number 3, when the world around us is falling apart, we should try and release the future. This is verses 8 through 13, the longest stretch so far. Let me hear what God the Lord will speak, for he will speak peace to his people, to his saints, but let them not turn back to folly. Surely his salvation is near to those who fear him, that glory may dwell in our land. Steadfast love and faithfulness meet, righteousness and peace kiss each other. Faithfulness springs up from the ground, and righteousness looks down from the sky. Yes, the Lord will give what is good, and our land will yield its increase. Righteousness will go before him and make his footsteps a way. Right off the bat, in verse 8, they remember what God has done in the past. They reflect on those things. They request his help in the present while they're going through these difficulties. And then when it comes to the future, it says, you know what? I'm just going to stop now. I'm going to listen to what God has to say. I'm going to be quiet and wait for his answer. We'll come back to that in just a second, because that is not the first place I go. But they say, let's hear what God is going to say. Let's wait and see, because, verse 8, he will speak. And this is the first of several future tense verbs that they're going to use here. We know he is going to speak to us, and what he is going to speak is going to bring peace to his people, to his saints. We're still God's people. And they're standing there in God's promised land that he promised to his people, and it doesn't look like it's supposed to look, but they know that they are not abandoned. He's going to speak to us, and so we're going to wait and listen. And this is pretty easy for them to do, at least to some degree, because of verse 10. Steadfast love and faithfulness meet, righteousness and peace kiss each other. Those 4 things, love, faithfulness, righteousness, peace, 2 of them have already been dealt with in the psalm already. If you go on back up to verse 7, show us your steadfast love, O Lord. Love is a part of who God is, and they know that. That makes their future thoughts that much easier, because they know who God is. They've also already dealt with this idea of peace prior to that, right there in verse 8. He will speak peace to his people. So love and peace have already been touched on in this psalm. They know that God is not only love, but that the words God brings with him are ones of peace. They know that even though everything around them is chaotic and falling apart and not the way they want it to be, that they are going to have peace because God brings peace and God brings love. The other 2, faithfulness and righteousness, they immediately go on to discuss in verse 11 and then again in verse 13 with righteousness. Faithfulness springs up from the ground, righteousness looks down from the sky. When God shows up, there is love and faithfulness and righteousness and peace. They know who God is, and so they can say in verse 12, yes, the Lord. Yes, he will give what is good. And our land is going to yield its increase. It's going to be the promised land again. Why? Because we know who God is. Righteousness is going to go before him. Why? Because we know who God is. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked with him. And he will make a way, because he always does. And so they can come to the end of this psalm in verses 8 through 13 and say, we're going to let go of our concerns for the future because we know the God that is in control of all of that. We know him far too well. We know that things are going to be okay. And we can say with confidence that even the land, that as they're surveying it, has stones that are laying next to each other. This isn't a wall, that's not a temple, these aren't homes, but that's going to change because God's involved in this. They're confident because they know who he is, even though they have no idea how long it's going to take to get there, what all it's going to require to get to that point. They know that God's going to bring them there. And so they can look at their future and say, you know, we're dealing with a lot, but we can let God have it. When the world around us is falling apart, the people of God release the future over to God. Oftentimes, we try to hold on to it. Instead of handing it over, we want to hold on to it as tightly as we can, or feel like we are holding on to it to some degree. We want more control, or at least the feeling that we have some amount of control, whether it's real or not. Because that's the only way we're going to make it through the future. Okay, verse 8, let me hear what the Lord is going to say. For me, and maybe this isn't for you, for me it's, okay, I'm going to talk to God and tell him how I think this stuff is going to play out. I'm not going to listen. I need to explain to God, God, this is what I think needs to happen in order for all this to fall together the way that I think it's supposed to work. So here we go. Okay, listening is not the thing I do, it's the opposite. And then alongside that, we take our present circumstance and we look around and go, yeah, the world's falling around me, whatever it is. And we extrapolate from there. I can't see this getting better tomorrow, and I can't see it getting better the day after that. And next week, why wouldn't it still be here? And a month from now, I don't know how this is going to get any better. And so we look into our future, but we can't get out of the present. And so we take the present trouble and say, this is just my life now. This is going to go with me forever. This is just how it's going to be. But we don't want it to be that way. And so we try to say, all right, if I do this, it'll fix it. Okay, that didn't work, but if I do this time it'll fix it. And you know what that causes is anxiety and worry and fear and panic. And we make mistakes, and things continue to just snowball out of control. But at least I can say, you know what, I'm trying to get a handle on it at least. We try to grip and hold and cling to the future that we think is going to happen if we just do all of the right things, when in reality, the people of God, when the world is falling apart around us, should just learn to let go. We let go of our unknown future to the God that we know very well. He is going to deal with that. And how do we know that? Okay, there's a reason future comes at the end. Okay, we've already seen what he's done, and we're asking him to do it again in the present like he's always done then. And by the way, the people in the past, where we can look back and say, God did this, they also found themselves in the same boat where they were requesting in their present difficulty, God, please do this. He did, and now it's in the past. And we can look at it and say, God did that in the past, so he'll do it in our present because he did it in their present. And then we can look ahead to the future now at the end of the psalm and say, it's going to be good because it always turns out good because of who God is every time. When the world's falling apart, the people of God reflect on the past, request in the present, and release the future. This David Goggins. Same man from before. Looks a little different here. Here's what happened. After coming home from work late one evening with a milkshake in hand, the young David Goggins came across an ad. On the television, there were young men his age going through Navy SEAL training. He saw fit and healthy men subjected to physical conditions akin to torture. Something clicked for David. It was fascinating to him why people would do this to themselves. All throughout his life, he had been running away from discomfort, yet discomfort had always seemed to find him. Right then and there, he decided to split from the program. He quit his cockroach spraying job, and he applied to join the Navy SEALs with a singular purpose, his words, to take one of the weakest men that God had ever created and make him one of the strongest. At first, nobody took him seriously, and many laughed in his face. But none of it fazed him, as he trained to lose over 100 pounds in a mere 3 months' time, studying all the while. That hard work paid off, and he was finally admitted to the SEAL Academy. But that's not it. David Goggins went on to complete multiple of these grueling training weeks in which he endured sleep deprivation, extreme cold, psychological abuse from his instructors, much like what he saw on television, but even more real because it was his real life. Where most people didn't even finish, David Goggins finished that toughest of weeks of SEAL training multiple times. That wasn't intentional. Here's what happened. His body kept rolling him back. First, as he's going through all of this training, he gets double pneumonia, has to drop out. He's already gone through some amount of it, has to stop because of double pneumonia. He goes back, then he fractures his kneecap another time going through it, has to stop and do it again once he heals up. But he kept going through. After this, David would go on to challenge himself in ways unimaginable to the normal human being. His list of accomplishments would eventually include completing over 60 ultra marathons while raising money for fallen soldiers' children. He would complete Delta Force training as well. He would obtain the Guinness World Record for most pull-ups performed in 24 hours. He would go through multiple heart surgeries for a congenital heart failure, heart defect, and not skip a beat. Pun intended. That was the writer. That wasn't my joke. He has become one of the best live recruiters for the U.S. Navy by orating his story and message across the country as a man who had a stutter and was labeled as educationally challenged. And when asked what he was desired, here's what he said: to be uncommon among uncommon people. A man whose life you could easily say was falling around him all the time. And he said, I wanted to be uncommon among uncommon people. I looked at that difficulty and did something about it. When the world is falling apart for you as a person of God, what do you do? This quote on the screen I thought was very interesting because of what happens when we do what the people of Psalm 85 did in their weariness, by which I mean the reflecting on the past, requesting in the present, releasing the future. When we do those things, two things happen, two results. One, we become more in touch with the God of love and faithfulness and righteousness and peace. If you are panicked and worried, then you need the God of peace more than you ever have before. That's where the help is going to come from. But two, when people of the world who are panicking about everything, that are looking about all of the things we listed at the beginning, whether it be a disease or stuff going on in their personal life or what's going on within the government or anything else, when they are falling apart, scared to death, and they see a group of people who is not like that at all, then they wonder what in the world is going on with those people. Are they not aware of what's happening in the world? They become interested in why there are people that are being so uncommon, so weird among everybody else. That prompts questions that maybe prompts a return or a first coming to God. If we want to know how to reach people right now, there's a great place to start. Model Psalm 85 and show people that, there is a lot of stuff going on, but you know what? I'm okay with it because I know who's working in all of it. Here's what I want to ask you to do. Whether it be right now, you're in a time of weariness right now, maybe you need to do this now, maybe you feel fine. We're going through Psalm 85 and you're going, hey, that's what I'm doing right now, so I'm doing pretty good. Okay, but if there comes a point in the future where you go, man, the world feels like it's falling down around me, three things. These words will sound very familiar if you've been paying attention to the lesson. If you haven't been paying attention to the lesson, thanks for joining us here. This will be over real quick. First, reflect on the past. Whether that is a mental list or something you actually write out, think about all of those times that you have dealt with something where you felt, how am I going to get out of this? And looking back on it now, you go, oh, that's how we got out of it. God got me out of it. Put those things down. Number two, let your requests be made known to God in the present. Stop and say, God, I know that you have delivered me in the past. I am asking that you please do that again. Knowing that he will do it, because he's done it before. And number three, release the future over to him. Don't make this one a mental list. Really write this one down. Okay, write down those things that in your current, the world is falling apart around me moment. Stop and write down the things that you are afraid of happening. What you are scared the future is going to look like, what you are concerned is going to result if things remain unchanged. Write all of those down in as much detail as you want and throw it in the trash. Because God is going to deal with it. It's not yours to deal with. All we can do is trust that God is going to do what he's always done. That's our job. And if we can do that, and that's easier said than done, if we can do that, we're going to look a lot different than the people that we're around. I want to extend this invitation tonight to groups. Number one, if you're here or you're watching it at home or you're watching this later, whenever it is, and you feel very much like everything is falling apart, we want to introduce you to the God that fixes all that broken stuff. And there are people here, I'm visiting, but as my uncle said, welcome home. I know many of you, and I know that there are many people here that are ready to study and say, this is how you come to know the God of love and faithfulness and righteousness and peace. Invitation number two. And if you feel like you need to respond to this, but the front row scares you, understandable. Say it in the foyer, call somebody later, but don't leave it undealt with if it needs to be dealt with. If you are scared about what's going on, there are people around you that want to walk this with you. And it is easier to do this together. This psalm by the sons of Korah, it's multiple people. There'll be multiple people for you too to deal with this stuff. And I encourage you to reflect, request, and release. Because doing that not only means good things for you, but it may mean a complete change in the people that we encounter. Let's stand and sing together.